The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Frogmore Cottage as Prince Harry stood at the window, his phone trembling slightly in his hands. The email from Netflix had arrived 3 days ago, but he had read it countless times, each word carrying the weight of possibility and terror in equal measure. The streaming giant wanted to commission a documentary series unlike any other, one that would follow his genuine attempts to rebuild the fractured relationships with his father, King Charles III, and his brother, Prince William. Harry's wife Meghan moved quietly behind him, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. She had been watching him wrestle with this decision since the proposal arrived, knowing that behind his outward composure lay years of pain, regret, and desperate hope for reconciliation. The couple had built a new life in California, far from the suffocating protocols and endless scrutiny of royal life, but the distance had done nothing to heal the wounds that had torn their family apart. "You're thinking about it again," Meghan said gently, placing a warm cup of tea beside him on the windowsill. Her voice carried no judgment, only the understanding that came from witnessing his struggle firsthand. Harry nodded, his eyes still fixed on the gardens where he and William had once played as children, their laughter echoing through these same grounds when their mother, Princess Diana, would bring them here for quiet family moments away from the public eye. Those memories felt like glimpses into another lifetime, when the brothers were inseparable and their father seemed like a distant but benevolent figure who would one day guide them both into their royal duties. "I keep wondering if this is the right way," Harry admitted, finally, turning to face his wife. "Part of me thinks it's exactly what we need, a chance to show the world that we're not the villains they painted us to be. But another part of me wonders if I'm just setting us all up for more pain." The Netflix proposal was ambitious in its scope and radical in its transparency. Unlike the carefully orchestrated documentaries that had been made about the royal family before, this series would have unprecedented access to Harry's personal journey as he attempted to bridge the chasm that had opened between him and the two most important men in his life. The cameras would follow him as he navigated the delicate process of reaching out to his father and brother, documenting both the successes and failures along the way. Meghan settled into the chair beside him, her hand finding his in the familiar gesture of support that had sustained them through their most difficult moments. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked, knowing that Harry's decisions were often torn between his logical mind and his emotional instincts. Harry closed his eyes, trying to quiet the noise in his head and listen to something deeper. The truth was that despite everything that had happened, the public statements, the tell-all interviews, the books and documentaries that had widened the rift between them, he missed his family terribly. He missed the easy camaraderie he had once shared with William, the way they could communicate with just a look during official events. He missed the pride he felt when his father would include him in important decisions, treating him not just as a spare heir but as a valued advisor and son. "I think about Archie and Lilibet," Harry said quietly, opening his eyes to look at Meghan. "I think about how they're growing up without knowing their grandfather is king, without understanding the history they're part of. And I think about how William's children will grow up knowing Uncle Harry only through tabloid headlines and family whispers." The weight of that reality had been growing heavier with each passing month. Their children, innocent of the adult conflicts that had divided their family, were the ones paying the ultimate price. Archie, now old enough to ask questions about why they didn't visit Grandpa Charles or Uncle William, had begun to notice the absence of extended family in their California life. Lilibet, named after her great-grandmother Queen Elizabeth II, might grow up never understanding the significance of her name or her place in a centuries-old institution. Meghan squeezed his hand gently. "You know I'll support whatever decision you make," she said. "But I also know that this kind of opportunity might not come again. If there's a chance that cameras could help break through the walls that have been built up, maybe it's worth the risk." Harry picked up the Netflix email again, scanning the carefully worded proposal. The production team they were suggesting had a reputation for handling sensitive material with both honesty and compassion. They had made documentaries about other public figures navigating personal crises, always managing to find the humanity behind the headlines. The series would be structured around Harry's attempts to reconnect with his family, but it would also explore the broader themes of forgiveness, healing, and the possibility of redemption even after very public fallingouts. "They want to call it The Return," Harry said, reading from the proposal. "Not as in returning to royal duties, but returning to family. They think it could be something unprecedented, a real-time documentation of whether damaged relationships can actually be repaired when the whole world is watching. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that Harry's greatest moments of vulnerability with his family had always played out under public scrutiny. From his mother's funeral, where a 12-year-old boy walked behind her coffin while millions watched, to his wedding day joy, to the painful announcement of their decision to step back from royal duties, none of their family's most significant moments had ever been private. In some ways, the Netflix cameras would simply be making visible what had always been true, that their personal relationships were inevitably public property. What would the first step be? Meghan asked, practical as always about the logistics of their decisions. Harry scrolled down to the proposed timeline. They want to start by documenting my decision-making process, how I work up the courage to reach out to them. Then, they'd follow me as I actually make contact, starting with Dad, I think. They believe that if he agrees to participate, William might follow. The thought of that first phone call to his father made Harry's stomach tighten with anxiety. They had spoken since the public revelations about the royal family's handling of Meghan's mental health struggles and the conversations about their son's potential skin color, but those conversations had been strained and formal, focused on practical matters rather than emotional healing. The idea of calling Charles and asking not just for a meeting, but for a meeting that would be documented for the world to see, felt both terrifying and potentially liberating. He might say no, Harry said, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath all his considerations. They both might say no, and then we'd have a documentary about my failed attempts to reconnect with my family. I'm not sure I could handle that kind of public rejection. Meghan was quiet for a long moment, considering this possibility. Or, she said finally, they might surprise you. Charles has always loved you, even when he hasn't known how to show it properly. And William. She paused, choosing her words carefully. William has been hurt, but hurt comes from love. If they see that you're genuinely trying to rebuild rather than tear down, they might meet you halfway. Harry stood up and walked to another window, this one facing toward London. Somewhere in that direction, his father was likely starting his day as king, reviewing briefings and preparing for official duties that Harry had once been training to support. William was probably getting his own children ready for school, living the life of a future king that Harry had once helped him prepare for. The distance between them felt both infinite and bridgeable, depending on how he chose to look at it. The proposal says they want to show the real process of forgiveness, Harry said, still reading. Not just the happy ending, but all the messy, difficult work that comes before it. The false starts, the misunderstandings, the moments when it feels impossible. That realistic approach appealed to Harry more than a sanitized version that glossed over the genuine difficulties they would face. He had learned through his own therapy and personal growth work that healing wasn't a straight line, and any documentary that pretended otherwise would be dishonest. The public had seen enough carefully managed royal appearances. Perhaps what they needed to see was the real work of being human, even when you happen to be born into extraordinary circumstances. His phone buzzed with a text message, and Harry's heart jumped when he saw it was from an unexpected source, his cousin Eugenie, who had managed to maintain relationships with both sides of the family divide. Saw some news reports about a possible documentary project, her message read. Don't know if it's true, but wanted you to know that some of us are hoping you find your way back to each other. The family isn't the same without you. Harry showed the message to Meghan, feeling a surge of emotion at this small gesture of support. Eugenie had always been someone who refused to take sides, maintaining her love for Harry and Meghan while also staying loyal to the wider family. Her message felt like a sign that not everyone viewed him as irredeemably outside the royal circle. Maybe that's what this documentary could really be about, Harry said, an idea beginning to take shape. Not just my relationship with Dad and William, but about how families can find their way back to each other even after everything feels broken. Maybe our story could help other people who are dealing with their own family rifts. Meghan nodded, seeing the spark of purpose that was beginning to grow in her husband's eyes. You've always said you wanted your royal status to mean something beyond ribbon cuttings and ceremonial duties. Maybe this is how you use your platform to actually make a difference. The morning was advancing, and Harry knew that the Netflix executives were waiting for his decision. The production timeline they had proposed was aggressive. They wanted to begin filming within weeks, believing that the authenticity of the project depended on capturing Harry's genuine uncertainty and hope rather than waiting until he had already figured everything out. "I think I need to call someone first," Harry said suddenly, reaching for his phone. "Before I commit to cameras and production schedules and all of that. I think I need to call Dad and just talk to him. Not about the documentary, not about the past, just check in. See how he's doing as king, ask about his health, be his son for a few minutes." Meghan smiled, recognizing this as a crucial shift in Harry's thinking. "That sounds like exactly the right first step," she said. Harry scrolled through his contacts until he found the number labeled simply Dad. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment, knowing that this conversation could set the tone for everything that followed. Whether or not the Netflix documentary happened, whether or not his family relationships could be repaired, it would all begin with this simple act of reaching out. "Whatever happens," Meghan said, as if reading his thoughts, "you'll know you tried. And sometimes trying is the bravest thing you can do." Harry pressed the call button and listened to the international dial tone, each ring carrying him further from the safety of distance and closer to the possibility of either healing or heartbreak. As the phone continued to ring, he found himself whispering a small prayer, not for success, necessarily, but for the courage to stay open to whatever response awaited him. The morning sun had climbed higher now, filling the room with warm light that seemed to promise new beginnings were possible, even for princes who had lost their way home. The phone rang 4 times before Harry heard the familiar voice of his father's private secretary, a man who had served the royal household for nearly 2 decades and who recognized Harry's number immediately despite the months that had passed since their last contact. "Your Royal Highness," the secretary said with professional warmth, "what a pleasant surprise. His Majesty is in his study reviewing agricultural reports, but I'm certain he'll want to speak with you. Please hold for just a moment." Harry's heart pounded as he waited, Meghan's reassuring presence beside him the only thing keeping him grounded. Through the phone, he could hear muffled conversation, the rustle of papers, and then footsteps approaching. When his father's voice came on the line, it carried a mixture of surprise, caution, and something that might have been hope. "Harry?" King Charles said, his tone carefully neutral but not cold. "This is unexpected. How are you, my boy?" The simple question, spoken in the voice that had read him bedtime stories and offered comfort during childhood nightmares, nearly undid Harry's composure entirely. "I'm well, Dad," he managed, his voice steadier than he had expected. I was thinking about you. About how you're adjusting to everything. Being king is what you've prepared for your whole life, but I imagine it still feels overwhelming sometimes." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Harry could almost see his father processing this unexpected turn toward genuine concern rather than the careful formality that had characterized their recent interactions. "It is overwhelming," Charles admitted, his voice softening slightly. "Your grandmother left rather large shoes to fill, and there are days when I feel quite lost without her guidance. But the work itself is deeply fulfilling. I find myself thinking often about the kind of legacy we're building for future generations." The opening was there, gentle and natural, and Harry found himself responding with genuine curiosity about his father's new role rather than the defensive postures that had marked their previous conversations. They talked for nearly 20 minutes about Charles's priorities as king, his concerns about climate change and social inequality, his efforts to modernize the monarchy while respecting its traditions. It was the longest unguarded conversation they had shared in years. "Dad," Harry said finally, when the conversation had settled into comfortable territory, "I need to ask you something, and I want to be completely honest with you about why." Charles's voice grew slightly more cautious. "Of course. What is it?" "Netflix has approached me about a documentary series," Harry said, choosing his words carefully. "Not another tell-all or exposé, but something different. They want to document my attempts to rebuild our relationship, yours and mine, and hopefully William's too. The idea would be to show the real process of family healing, with all its complications and setbacks, but ultimately working toward genuine reconciliation." The silence that followed felt endless. Harry could hear his father's breathing, could almost sense the wheels turning as Charles weighed the implications of such a project. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of a man who had spent decades navigating public relations crises. "That's quite an undertaking," Charles said slowly. "And quite a risk, for all of us." "What has prompted this particular approach?" Harry had prepared for this question, but hearing it from his father made him realize how deeply he needed to dig into his own motivations. "I miss you," he said simply. "I miss our family. I know that might be hard to believe given everything that's happened, but the truth is that distance hasn't healed anything for me. It's just made me realize how much I lost when our relationships fell apart." Another pause, shorter this time. "I miss you too," Charles said quietly, and Harry felt tears spring to his eyes at the admission. "But I'm also afraid, Harry. We've all said and done things that have caused tremendous pain. The idea of working through that healing process in front of cameras, it feels rather exposed." "I know," Harry agreed. "That's exactly why I wanted to talk to you first, before I gave Netflix any kind of answer. This only works if we're all genuinely committed to the process, not just performing reconciliation for the cameras. And it only works if you and William actually want to repair our relationships, not just manage the public perception of them." Charles was quiet for several minutes, and Harry could hear papers rustling as his father apparently set aside his work to give full attention to their conversation. "What does Megan think of this idea?" Charles asked. The question surprised Harry with its genuine interest rather than the polite formality that usually characterized any mention of his wife in their conversations. "She's supportive," Harry said. "She knows how much I've struggled with our estrangement, and she wants me to find peace with our family. But she's also protective of our children and our privacy, so she wants to make sure this would actually help rather than just create more drama." "And what about the children?" Charles asked, his voice warming noticeably. "How are Archie and Lillibut?" This question broke down another wall that Harry hadn't even realized he was maintaining. For the next several minutes, he found himself telling his father about his children's latest milestones, their personalities, their questions about the family they rarely saw. Charles listened with obvious delight, occasionally laughing at Archie's precocious observations or asking follow-up questions about Lillibut's development. "They ask about you," Harry admitted. "Archie especially. He knows you're his grandfather, and he knows you're the king, but he doesn't understand why we don't visit or why you don't come to California. I try to explain in age-appropriate ways, but it's difficult." "I think about them constantly," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have photographs that Eugenie shares sometimes, but it's not the same as watching them grow up. I want to be part of their lives, Harry. I want them to know their heritage and their family." The conversation had taken a turn that neither of them had explicitly planned, but that felt more honest and necessary than any of their previous attempts at reconciliation. They were talking as father and son, grandfather and father, rather than as public figures managing a crisis. "The documentary idea," Harry said, returning to the central question, "I think part of what appeals to me is that it could show people that these kinds of family rifts aren't insurmountable. That even when things feel completely broken, there might be a way forward if everyone is willing to do the work." Charles sighed deeply. "I've been king for such a short time, and already I've learned that every decision I make affects not just our family but the institution itself. A project like this could be healing, but it could also backfire spectacularly if we're not careful about how it's handled." "What if we started smaller?" Harry suggested, an idea forming as they talked. "What if I came to London, just for a few days, and we tried having some honest conversations without cameras first? If those go well, if we feel like we're making genuine progress, then maybe we consider documenting the next phase." The suggestion seemed to ease some of Charles's concerns. "That feels more manageable," he agreed. "And it would give us a chance to see whether this reconciliation is something we can actually achieve, or whether the wounds are too deep to heal." They talked through the logistics of such a visit, discussing how to handle the inevitable media attention and speculation. Charles suggested that Harry could stay at Clarence's house, in his old rooms, giving them privacy for their conversations while also sending a symbolic message about his welcome back into the family fold. "There's something else," Charles said as their conversation began to wind down. "William is struggling too. He's been under enormous pressure since becoming heir apparent, and he misses you more than he's willing to admit. I think he might be open to rebuilding your relationship, but he's also been hurt deeply by some of the public statements. He feels betrayed, but I believe that feeling comes from love rather than indifference." This insight into his brother's emotional state gave Harry both hope and concern. He had known that William would be struggling with the increased responsibilities and scrutiny, but hearing that his brother might actually be open to reconciliation was more than Harry had dared to hope for. "Would you be willing to talk to him?" Harry asked. "Not to pressure him, just to gauge whether he'd be interested in trying to work things out?" "I think that would be appropriate," Charles said. "In fact, I think it would be beneficial for all of us if you came home soon, documentary or no documentary. We need to have these conversations, and they need to happen in person rather than through intermediaries and public statements." As their call ended, Harry felt a mixture of excitement and terror about what he had set in motion. The conversation with his father had gone better than he had dared to hope, but it had also made the stakes of this reconciliation attempt feel much more real and immediate. Meghan had listened to his side of the conversation with growing amazement, watching her husband's posture relax and his voice become more animated as he talked with his father. When he hung up the phone, she was smiling with tears in her eyes. "That sounded like a real conversation," she said simply. "It was," Harry agreed, still processing everything that had been said. "He wants to try, Megs. He actually wants to try to fix this." They spent the rest of the morning discussing the logistics of a trip to London, the arrangements they would need to make for their children, the security considerations, and the emotional preparation Harry would need to do before facing both his father and, potentially, his brother in person. By afternoon, Harry had drafted a response to Netflix, explaining that he was interested in their proposal but wanted to explore the possibility of reconciliation privately first, with cameras potentially joining the process later if initial efforts proved promising. The production team's response was enthusiastic and supportive, expressing their belief that this approach would actually make for a more authentic and compelling documentary. That evening, as Harry and Meghan put their children to bed, Archie asked his usual question about when they would visit Grandpa Charles. For the first time in months, Harry was able to answer with genuine hope rather than vague promises. "Soon, buddy," he said, tucking his son under his favorite blanket. "Very soon." 3 weeks later, Harry stood in the arrivals lounge at Heathrow Airport, his heart racing as he scanned the familiar faces of his security detail. The flight from Los Angeles had given him 11 hours to second-guess his decision, to imagine every possible way the upcoming reunion could go wrong, and to practice the conversations he hoped to have with his father and brother. The drive to Clarence House took him through neighborhoods that held decades of memories, past the parks where he and William had played football as children, the restaurants where they had celebrated birthdays and achievements, the streets where they had walked behind their mother's funeral procession. London felt both like home and like foreign territory, a place where he belonged and was simultaneously an outsider. His father was waiting in the private sitting room when Harry arrived, still dressed in the formal attire of his afternoon appointments but with a warmth in his eyes that had been absent from their public encounters for years. The embrace they shared was tentative at first, then fierce, both men holding on perhaps a moment longer than protocol would typically allow. "You look well," Charles said, stepping back to study his younger son. "California agrees with you." "Thank you for agreeing to this," Harry replied, gesturing vaguely toward the room, the palace, the entire unprecedented situation they were creating. "I know it's not easy, having me here with everything so unsettled between us." Charles poured tea from the service that had been prepared, the familiar ritual providing a comfortable framework for their awkward reunion. "Nothing about being king has been easy," he said with a slight smile. "But having my son home, even temporarily, even with complications, feels right in a way that surprises me." They settled into chairs that faced each other across a small table, the formal arrangement somehow making their conversation feel more intentional and important. Harry noticed that his father had removed his signet ring and set it aside, a small gesture that seemed to signal his willingness to speak as a father rather than as a monarch. "I've been thinking constantly about our phone conversation," Charles said, his hands wrapped around his teacup for warmth. "About the documentary idea, yes, but more importantly about what you said about missing our family." I realized that in all our careful communications over the past few years, we've been so focused on managing the public aspects of our relationship that we've forgotten to tend to the private ones." Harry nodded, feeling the truth of this observation settle between them. "I think I've been so defensive about protecting Meghan and our new life that I lost sight of the fact that defending our choices didn't have to mean attacking our family. Those became conflated in ways that hurt everyone. And I think I've been so concerned with protecting the institution and maintaining stability during a time of tremendous change that I forgot my primary job is to be your father," Charles admitted. "The crown has responsibilities, but so does love, and love should have taken priority." The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared since Harry's childhood. Charles talked openly about his own struggles with his new role, his fears about whether he could live up to his mother's legacy, his concerns about the future of the monarchy in a rapidly changing world. Harry shared his own challenges with finding purpose and identity outside the royal framework, his guilt about the impact his departure had on his family, his hopes for his children's future. As the afternoon stretched into evening, their conversation moved through years of accumulated hurts and misunderstandings. Charles acknowledged the ways the royal system had failed to support Meghan during her transition into the family, expressing regret that he had prioritized institutional concerns over his daughter-in-law's well-being. Harry admitted that some of his public statements had been unnecessarily harsh, motivated more by pain than by truth. "There's something I need to tell you," Charles said as dinner was being served in the private dining room. "I've spoken with William about your visit, and about the possibility of the three of us having a conversation while you're here." Harry's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "How did that go?" "Better than I expected, actually. He's angry, and he's hurt, but he's also exhausted by this estrangement. He misses his brother, Harry, even if his pride makes it difficult for him to admit that." "Does he want to see me?" Charles considered his words carefully. "He wants to see you, if that makes sense. He's afraid of being disappointed again, afraid of opening himself up to more pain, but he recognizes that this situation isn't sustainable for any of us, especially now that he's heir apparent and will need your support more than ever." The idea that William might need him, might actually want his support and partnership in their shared royal responsibilities, was something Harry hadn't considered. He had been so focused on his own sense of loss and displacement that he hadn't thought about how his departure might have affected his brother's ability to fulfill his own duties. "When?" Harry asked simply. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're ready." "Here, in private, with no staff present except for security. Just the three of us, talking as a family." Harry spent that night in his old bedroom at Clarence House, surrounded by photographs and mementos from a life that felt both distant and immediate. He called Meghan before going to sleep, sharing the highlights of his conversation with Charles and his nervousness about the upcoming meeting with William. "How do you feel?" Meghan asked, her voice soft across the international connection. "Hopeful," Harry said, surprising himself with the admission. "And terrified. But mostly hopeful." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as Harry accompanied his father to several official engagements, observing the rhythms of Charles's daily life as king. It was the first time Harry had seen his father in his official capacity since the coronation, and he was struck by how naturally Charles had grown into the role, how seamlessly he balanced the ceremonial aspects with genuine engagement with the people he met. At a community center in East London, Harry watched his father interact with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, seeing the passion and genuine care that drove Charles's work on social issues. Several of the young people recognized Harry and expressed excitement about his presence, asking questions about his life in America and his charitable work. "It's good to see you working together again," one teenage girl said to Harry as they prepared to leave. "You and your dad, I mean. You make a good team." The comment stayed with Harry throughout the morning, making him realize how much he had missed the sense of purpose that came from royal work, the feeling of using his platform and privilege to make a tangible difference in people's lives. When they returned to Clarence House for lunch, William was already waiting in the sitting room, his posture formal but his eyes betraying the emotional significance of this moment. The two brothers hadn't been alone together in over 2 years, and the weight of their shared history filled the room as they faced each other. "Hello, William," Harry said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Harry," William replied, his tone carefully neutral but not hostile. "You look well." Charles excused himself after a few minutes of stilted small talk, leaving his sons alone to navigate the conversation they had been avoiding for so long. The silence that followed his departure was charged with years of unspoken grievances, dashed expectations, and buried love. "I didn't think you'd come," William said finally, settling into the chair their father had vacated. "I wasn't sure I would either, until I was actually on the plane," Harry admitted. "But I needed to try, Will. I needed to see if there was anything left to salvage." William studied his brother's face, looking for signs of the manipulation or hidden agenda he had trained himself to expect from their interactions. Instead, he saw genuine vulnerability and something that looked like the younger brother he had once protected and guided. "I've been angry with you for a long time," William said, his voice quiet but firm. "Angry about the way you left, angry about the things you said publicly, angry about the position you put the family in during some of our most vulnerable moments." Harry nodded, accepting this truth without defensiveness. "I know. And I've been angry too about feeling pushed out, about the way Megan was treated, about feeling like I had to choose between my family and my wife. But I'm tired of being angry, Will. It's not serving either of us." The conversation that followed was painful in its honesty. William expressed his feelings of betrayal and abandonment, his sense that Harry had chosen drama and attention over family loyalty. Harry shared his own feelings of being misunderstood and unsupported, his belief that the institution had failed to protect the people he loved most. But, as they talked, something began to shift. The defensive walls they had both erected started to crumble as they remembered not just their recent conflicts but their decades of shared experience. William talked about the pressure he felt as the heir apparent, the weight of knowing that every decision he made would affect not just his own family but the future of the monarchy itself. Harry acknowledged that he had underestimated these pressures, that he had been so focused on his own struggles that he had failed to consider what his brother was going through. "I need you, Harry," William said suddenly, the admission seeming to surprise them both. "I know that might be hard to believe given everything that's happened, but I do. This job, this responsibility, it's too much for one person. I always thought we'd be doing it together, that when the time came, I'd have my brother beside me." Harry felt tears spring to his eyes at this unexpected vulnerability from his brother. "I want to help," he said. "I don't know how, exactly, given where we are now, but if there's a way to rebuild what we had, if there's a way for me to support you while still maintaining the life Megan and I have built, I want to find it." They talked late into the afternoon, working through years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. By the time Charles returned to check on them, both brothers were emotionally drained but cautiously optimistic about the possibility of moving forward. "How did it go?" Charles asked, settling into his chair and looking between his two sons. "We have a lot of work to do," William said, speaking for both of them. "But I think we want to do the work." Harry nodded his agreement. "We've agreed that we want to try to rebuild our relationship, but we need to do it slowly and carefully. No grand gestures or public announcements, just honest conversations and gradual trust building." Charles smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Harry had seen from his father in years. "That sounds like wisdom." As evening fell over London, the three men shared dinner together for the first time since Harry's wedding day. The conversation was lighter than their earlier discussions, touching on family memories, current events, and plans for the future. For brief moments, it felt almost like old times, before the pressures of royal duty and personal conflicts had driven them apart. "There's something else we should discuss," Harry said as dinner concluded. "The Netflix documentary. If we're serious about repairing our relationships, and if the process continues to go well, I think it could be valuable to document this journey. Not for entertainment, but to show people that even the most damaged family relationships can be healed with patience and genuine effort." William and Charles exchanged glances, having clearly discussed this possibility during Harry's absence. "We're not opposed to the idea," William said carefully. "But we'd want significant input into how the story is told, and we'd need guarantees that the focus would be on healing rather than sensationalizing our past conflicts." "Of course," Harry agreed. This would only work if we're all genuinely committed to the process and if we have control over how our story is presented. As Harry prepared to return to California the following week, all three men felt cautiously optimistic about the progress they had made. The wounds were far from healed, but they had taken the first crucial steps toward rebuilding their relationships. The documentary, they agreed, could wait until they had made more progress in private, but the possibility remained open if their healing continued to move forward. 6 months had passed since Harry's visit to London, and the tentative progress made during those few days had blossomed into something neither he nor his family had dared to hope for. Weekly video calls with his father had become a cherished routine, their conversations evolving from careful diplomacy to genuine warmth and mutual support. William had been slower to embrace regular contact, but monthly calls between the brothers had established a foundation of renewed trust and understanding. The turning point came when Archie fell seriously ill with pneumonia during the autumn months. Within hours of Harry's panicked call to his father, both Charles and William were offering support, resources, and genuine emotional